The UCP will be choosing their new leader on October the 6th. Now, the race to succeed Jason Kenney as premier continues to heat up. One of the frontrunners, Danielle Smith, found herself in a little bit of hot water recently. To talk about this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us from Edmonton. Tyler, what did Danielle Smith say exactly that received a little bit of backlash?
Well, she was on a podcast talking to a naturopath, and they were talking about cancer. And basically what she said was that when stage 4 cancer comes along, you have treatments, you have radiation, you have chemotherapy, those sorts of things. But she sort of implied that up to that point, cancer was sort of up to the choices that an individual might make. And there was a really, really quick and immediate backlash from that. The New Democrats got in on it, and then she said, well, the New Democrats just don't want to talk about cancer prevention. But then her fellow leadership candidates attacked her as well. You know, Brian Jean saying that as someone who's lost family and friends to cancer, that was a hurtful thing to say. Travis Taves, and pretty much everyone, Leela here, the whole sort of group of them really came down quite hard on her for this comment she'd made in the podcast. Whether or not that will matter remains to be seen, but it is the first, I would say, major slip up that she's had in this campaign.
Has she backpedaled at all on that comment?
No, it doesn't seem like it. Rather, she seems to have sort of doubled down by talking about cancer prevention. It would not shock me, though, if she had to backtrack in the next little while, though.
Now, speaking of Danielle Smith, her Alberta Sovereignty Act is picking up some steam as well. Explain, Tyler, exactly how it works and why House Leader Jason Nixon says it's illegal and unenforceable.
The idea is basically that if this act was passed, the Alberta government could decide to ignore federal government laws, regulatory decisions, and court rulings that they believe would affect Alberta in a negative way. So let's say there was a highway project and that was going through the impact assessment process. That's the process that was created by Bill C-69, if people cast their minds back. Her argument is that we would be able to go, no, we're not going to listen to the regulatory process the federal government sets out. Rather, we are going to be able to give out our own permits and business will continue. There are some obvious problems that people have pointed out with that. But Jason Nixon and Travis Taves in particular have come down quite hard on it. And Nixon is notable because, of course, he's not in the leadership race. And he said basically that, this probably wouldn't even pass even if the United Conservatives held the entire House, and that at any rate, it would be illegal and it would be unenforceable because, who's going to listen to the Alberta government when the federal government holds enforcement powers to levy fines and things like that. So the proposal's got a lot of attention in the last few weeks and has got quite a bit of criticism too from within the party.
Now, still with the leadership race, Tyler, we've crossed the threshold to the official candidates in the race to replace Premier Jason Kenney. And the 7 of them are Danielle Smith, who we just talked about, Brian Jean, Travis Taves, Leela Aheer, Rebecca Schultz, Todd Loewen, and Rajan Sani. Now, this means that 3 others failed to make the cut?
That's right. So the 3 others is Bill Rock, I believe, who's a Southern Alberta mayor, John Horsman, who's a businessman, and Raj Sherman, the former Liberal leader who had sort of intended to run in the race and obviously did not get very far with it. So they just sort of didn't meet the financial and paperwork sort of threshold. But the reason this is important, of course, is because now we know what that slate of candidates is going to look like unless someone else drops out over the next, 6 weeks or so here.
Now, some new polling numbers are out from Leger as to who the frontrunners are, and so far to succeed Premier Jason Kenney as UCP leader. Who's at the very top?
It is actually Danielle Smith at 22% support, and it's pretty neck and neck though, because you have Brian Jean coming in at 20%, and then Travis Taves lagging a little bit at 15%, and the others, barely sort of ranked in like the low single digits kind of thing. Now, I should point out that this poll was of people who sort of self-identified as UCP members, as opposed to actual party members potentially, and it also might say more about the amount of press coverage they're getting, the amount of attention they're getting, than it does about actual support. So a little bit hard to know exactly what that poll is telling us, I think, but conventional wisdom certainly suggests that Travis Taves, Brian Jean, and Danielle Smith are in the sort of front of the pack here. So it's good to have a few numbers, I guess, that support that assumption or analysis, I guess.
So Tyler, when it comes to the top of their platform for the top 3, when we're talking about Danielle Smith, Travis Taves, and Brian Jean, what is it really that they're focusing in on right now? Like, obviously, we talked a little bit about Daniel Smith with the Alberta Sovereignty Act, Travis Taves, the former finance minister, is all about keeping the books balanced. But what about with Brian Jean specifically?
Well, Brian Jean has gone really hard on some cost of living stuff lately. Primarily gas prices would be the thing that I think he's got the most attention for in the last little while. And you're totally right on the other two. Travis Taves has really been sort of a steady as she goes kind of guy. When we talked about the Alberta Sovereignty Act a moment ago, one of the things that he said about that is that a big issue for him is investor confidence and concerns about stability in the province. And so his criticism of the Alberta Sovereignty Act is actually that he thinks it will create less stability and make this a less attractive place for people to invest. So, for him, it's sort of, it's the economy stupid. And Danielle Smith is, of course, doing the sovereignty thing and talking about vaccinations and lockdowns and things like that. And Brian Jean also has sort of a sovereignty sort of platform, not sovereignty, that's not quite the right word, but more power to Alberta sort of platform that he's talked about as well. But for him, I think the biggest splash he's made has got to be on gas prices.
Yeah, speaking of which, Premier Kenney called on the Competition Bureau of Canada to probe gas prices, and they're finally beginning to come down.
They are, thankfully. Of course, people will remember when they dropped the fuel tax, would have been a couple months ago now, a month and a half ago maybe, that brought prices down or kept prices down by about 13 cents. And sort of over the course of the summer, that gap has sort of narrowed. And there's a potential handful of reasons why that's been the case, but is obviously causing some consternation. And Premier Kenney saying that, he wants to get to the bottom of this and find out whether or not there's price gouging going on at the pumps, which is also what Brian Jean has been saying, that he would, if he was Premier, he would use sort of regulatory powers to ensure that there was no price gouging at the pumps. But as you say, long weekend is coming up and prices have been trending downwards for the last couple of days. So if people are getting out of town, they might have some luck filling up the tank.
Yeah, what's interesting is around Lethbridge here in southwestern Alberta, a lot of the prices were $1.80, $1.85 a litre. And until Kenney called the Competition Bureau of Canada, then all of a sudden some, especially in Claresholm, it dropped down to $1.60, $1.45. I just filled up at UFA recently for $1.40. So yeah, it's nice to see that they're finally coming down, making life a little more affordable for us Albertans. Tyler, a big story we've been covering here on Bridge City News was how the Alberta Court of Appeal set aside some of the charges against Pastor Arthur Pawlowski, the street preacher in Calgary, his brother David, and Chris Scott, the owner of the Whistle Stop Cafe. It appears as though the court may have overstepped itself in sanctioning the three.
Yeah, it's a bit of a legally complicated story, as I understand it. But the gist is, yes, that they sort of went too far beyond what the Crown and the defense were sort of arguing about when it came to convicting them. And it was so we went up to the Court of Appeal, and a three-judge panel, I guess, basically threw out these particular convictions, and they had primarily to do with contempt of court for sort of continuing to defy court orders. So, the relevant thing here, I think, for sort of political purposes, is just that this story isn't done yet. The story of the pandemic, that the story of pandemic enforcement, that the discussion about lockdowns and all those sorts of things, even though the policies themselves are in the past, there's still sort of the residual effects of this. And we're going to see, I think, as the UCP leadership race continues, when the House comes back in the fall, we're going to continue to see some of these debates ongoing.
Tyler, former NDP MLA and current independent member of the legislature, Thomas Dang, says he will not run again in next year's provincial election. Dang had been trying to rejoin the NDP after getting into trouble for hacking vaccine records to show the website with the vaccine passports on it was not exactly safe.
That's right. So court documents from a couple weeks ago basically show that he used sort of a brute force hack, or it's alleged that he used a brute force hack to try and get through that vaccine portal to see whether or not it was secure. So he's sort of argued that this was called a white knight hacking procedure, that trying to expose vulnerabilities in the system as opposed to actually getting information. And he did find vulnerabilities and reported it to the NDP caucus, that then reported it to the health minister's office, I believe. And the RCMP came in and investigated him. So he was removed from the New Democratic caucus back in December or January, and has been sitting as an independent since then. He is facing a charge under I believe it's the Health Information Act. So it's not a criminal charge, but it does come with potential pretty hefty fines. But he'd been trying to rejoin the caucus and has sort of given up that fight and will not be running in next year's election. So just a little bit of a conclusion in some ways to part of his story at any rate.
You know, it's interesting. Some political pundits look at Alberta almost like the United States, a two-party system. In the U.S., the Republicans, Democrats, Alberta, NDP, and of course the UCP. What's going on with the Liberal Party? What have we heard from them lately?
Oh, well, very little, absolutely nothing in many ways. They had been, I think, selecting a new leader recently, but that honestly, that could have been the Alberta Party. Honestly, I should know. And even then, we haven't heard very much from the Wild Rose Independence Party since Paul Hinman ran in that by-election a couple months ago against Brian Jean, and he didn't win either. So maybe they're all on summer vacation and they'll come roaring back in the fall. I would expect that we'll start hearing from these smaller parties in the next few months, just because with an election coming up, there is always the chance of getting a seat or something like that. It hasn't always been, a two-party system.
That's true, yeah. Tyler, the province opened up fourth doses for COVID-19 vaccines. Some experts say now's the time to get it, while others argue maybe we should hold off. Can you explain why?
Well, it's because of the way that the variants of COVID are mutating, I guess, or evolving or adapting to get around vaccines. And so the question is whether or not the current vaccines are as effective against the current variants that we're dealing with. And so it might be better, some argue, to wait until there is a new vaccine that will more effectively combat these variants. But that's some months away, it seems to be the case, November, December potentially, and then a regulatory process. So, other experts saying that, look, this is a long ways off, especially if you're a vulnerable person, have an autoimmune condition or breathing problems or something like that, perhaps go get your fourth dose. But it does sort of come, I believe the sort of national vaccine body finally made its recommendation to open up doses to everyone over the age of 18. And so sort of all the provinces, I think, have moved to offer these doses in the last week or two.
Tyler, you're working at the legislature. Obviously, you rub shoulders with a lot of MLAs from all of the different parties. Is there any talk of Rachel Notley potentially stepping down if she loses next year's provincial election, and maybe having somebody like Shanna Phillips, should she secure her seat here in Lethbridge, to become party leader?
I haven't heard anything about that. I think the New Democrats are feeling pretty confident about their chances at the moment, even with Jason Kenney out of the picture, which causes them some electoral problems, I think. But no, I haven't heard very much about that. I mean, it's not hard to imagine that she would do it, but of course the question is, who is the obvious successor? Is it Darren Billis? Is it Shannon Phillips? Is it someone else? And so, it's hard to say, because even if they lose the next election, I would expect them to have a pretty substantial number of seats. They've been a very, very effective opposition party over the last few years. And they've also seen what the UCP is doing, which has gone through this sort of constant leadership chaos and what that means. So, I think there's probably arguments to either side, but I can't say I have any rumors or even useful information on that one.
He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Thanks a lot for joining us today from Edmonton.
Thanks for having me, Hal.